Our organizers are Action Aid, the East African Center for Human Rights, the European Network on Debt and Development, EURODAD, the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, Oxfam, the Society for International Development, Public Services International, and the Transnational Institute. Thank you so much for your work on this event and the work that you do. Before I introduce our panel, let me cover some housekeeping details. You can listen to this discussion in Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. To select your preferred language, please click the globe icon next to the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you will be able to select the option to mute the original audio if you just want to hear the interpretation. This event is being recorded, and we're asking all of you throughout this program and discussion to use the hashtag, the future is public. Hashtag, the future is public. I'll do that throughout the program. The event is being organized around three main questions, which panelists will be asked to respond to. There will be around 10 minutes for questions from the audience after all the selected panelists have responded to the particular question. Participants can submit questions to the experts in the question and answer function on Zoom. And we have a high number of participants, so we may not be able to see all who see or answer all the questions that are submitted. Participants are free to discuss the event as it progresses in the chat function. We ask that you be concise and respectful, and that the chat is going to be recorded at the end of the event, so your comments will be saved. Please remember to submit your questions in the chat function, not in the chat function, but in the question and answer function. And we are so excited. Right now, you're seeing a list of our speakers today. This event came about because in the past, we had 9 experts from the United Nations come together to discuss human rights impacts of privatization and strategies for reclaiming public services. We're delighted today to have 7 current and former UN Special Rapporteurs and representatives from 3 regional human rights bodies who are able to join us today. Their names are all listed. The amazing work that they do, we'll hear more about as we continue. But the names are listed on the speaker panel right now. Again, today's event builds on the discussion that was held last year, focusing on the crucial role of public services in addressing the crisis the world is currently facing, and in building socially just, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient services. As I said, we have a number of current and former special rapporteurs who are with us, as well as representatives from 3 regional human rights bodies. So we're very excited. And actually, I think before we start the panel, we are going to hear about a manifesto that was released yesterday. Last year's gathering led to the collective civil society manifesto on public services by a large number of civil society organizations. As I said, the manifesto was launched yesterday, and I now welcome Flora Sorkin from the Society of International Development to introduce the Civil Society Manifesto.
Thank you so much, Glenda. I'm trying to start my video. Okay, seems like I'm unable to start the video, but I'll go ahead and tell you all a little bit more about this Global Manifesto for Public Services, which we launched yesterday. First of all, I'm really glad to be here and speak on behalf of such a wide group of civil society organizations that have been working together on this manifesto for the past 10 months and really developing this collective thinking and vision for the public services that we want, but also how to get there. So this global manifesto that was launched yesterday actually came about as a demand from this global civil society strategy meeting that was organized last year, as Glenda was mentioning, that called for developing a collective narrative that could unite and represent and mobilize a really broad-based movement to challenge the privatization of public services, and also demand alternatives for the provision of services that could ensure the realization of human rights and support the process of overcoming global inequalities, both within and between countries as well. So this meeting actually happened right after the first public roundtable discussion that brought together different UN special rapporteurs across different mandates. And since then, a group of us have been meeting regularly since January this year to draft this collective manifesto. And for the past few months, we have been seeking inputs through really rich discussions that happen through a series of workshops and online discussions organized in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, West Africa, North Africa, and also North America. And the final version of this manifesto, which is now accessible on the website that you will see at the end of my slides, has actually received comments and inputs from over 300 people that represent a really wide range of civil society organizations that include public service advocates, economic justice, gender justice, climate and food justice advocates and organizations throughout the world. And the idea is to establish this clear and unifying vision of public services that can be used as a basis for advocacy and campaigning and movement building across different contexts, both from local and national, regional, but global levels as well. Because as you know, there are a lot of misconceptions around public services that have been really for long driven by a part of a neoliberal economic agenda that undermines states' capacity to mobilize resources to provide financing for universal quality public services. So a lot of the issues that we see currently around the world with public services are related to those systemic issues that, for instance, include unfair trade agreements, unsustainable debt, tax abuse, commodity dependence, and austerity measures, just to name a few. And as we know really all too well, the COVID pandemic only exposed these systemic challenges and all the inequalities that come with them, and showed us how the privatized and underfunded public services were really struggling to save lives and to protect workers. And through those issues, we have also seen how women have been subsidizing the global economy by their unpaid care work that was very often coming to fill in this gap of underfunded services. So as we see now in this moment of diverse and overlapping crises, we really need a new social contract to deliver public services that can be accessible to all. And with this manifesto, we try to position public services as the foundation of this fair and just society that we hope to see, implementing core values of solidarity, equality, and human dignity. And so with this manifesto, we outline some of the key dimensions of this vision that we hope to see. And you can see there some of the ways in which we organize this vision around the public services that we want, why public services matter, how funding public services is possible, and the role of the state in ensuring democratic and public control of public services, and the role of civil society as well. So we really hope that that this manifesto can be useful, and by this collective vision, we're trying to not only present a fantasy of what kind of public services would be possible in an ideal world, but we actually make really concrete demands and proposals for horizontal, trusted, democratically controlled public services that respond to the present challenges that we have and the crises we're facing, but also the crises we're going to face, especially in the context of the climate emergency, which world leaders will be meeting to address next week. So we really call on everyone to join this growing movement to demand true quality public services that are universal and that are sustainably financed. And we call you all to check out the website with the manifesto and join the already over 100 organizations that have signed on so far. And just want to be thankful to all the speakers who joined us today, who, as Glenda said, represent a really unprecedented representation of mandate holders around the world. And we're just really especially humbled by all the social movements around the world that are fighting for a just society where universal quality public services are accessible to all. So thank you, and look forward to the discussions ahead.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you for giving detail about this manifesto that gives us that clear unifying vision for public services. It's wonderful that we deal with the ideal, and that but we also have concrete demands and directions that people can move in order to get this invaluable work done. We now are going to move into our panel discussion, and our panelists can, I think, enable their video. And we're going to start, and the first four panelists are going to answer the first question. You'll get about 5 minutes apiece, and then we'll get questions from our audience that is tweeting and Instagramming using the Future is Public. We'll hear from Solomon, Aoife, Pedro, and Magdalena with our first question. And our first question is, the world is currently facing at least 3 intersecting major challenges: the ongoing impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the social and economic crisis it has triggered and also exposed, high and rising inequalities, and the climate and ecological crisis. What do you see as the role of public services in this context? Solomon?
Sorry, I'm unable to start the video from my side. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for kindly extending this invitation for me to join this distinguished panel and share some insights from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is the premier human rights body of the African Union system here on the African continent. I think the question of the role of public services, I think, has become prominent in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. For us on the African continent, with the advent of COVID-19, we have come to witness a number of observations and issues as far as public service is concerned. The first thing that we have observed is that
I think maybe just a little bit of a glitch with Solomon. We'll wait a couple of minutes. If that continues, why don't we just go to Aoife and we'll come back to Solomon when he comes back.
Are you happy for me to begin now, Glenda?
Yes, I think
That's
that
great.
makes
Well,
sense.
thank you. First of all, thank you so much to the organizers, and thank you so much to you, Glenda, for your very graceful chairing of the event. And it was a privilege. And oh, I see Solomon is back.
Solomon's
I wonder,
back.
should we return to him? You've heard my
Yes.
thanks. I can leap in later.
Yes, Solomon, sorry, we had just a bit of a glitch. Solomon, we see you moving. Would you, I think, why don't you continue? We lost you for a minute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think there is the connection is unstable here. So the first one is how the lack of access and the very widespread deprivation of access to public services have impacted on even being able to prevent oneself from contracting the COVID-19 pandemic virus. This relates to, for example, not only in terms of the lack of preparation of the health systems of the countries of the continent, but also even in terms of such basic prevention measures as washing hands. If you do not have access to water, you can't be able to wash your hands. Social distancing, if you are leaving, if you do not have a space for keeping your distance from others, if you are living in a crowded space, if you are working in a crowded space, then you couldn't be able to actually prevent yourself from contracting the virus. We have also come to witness in terms of the socio-economic consequences of COVID-19, how the lack of access to these basic services pushed many people into extreme poverty. By the time governments have adopted various measures which have put particularly vulnerable sections of society in the worst of positions, forced to choose between dying of hunger and dying of breaching the COVID-19 regulatory measures imposed, including lockdowns. This essentially is a result of a number of factors, obviously. One of the questions have to do with the extent to which public policies, governments, including social actors, as well as human rights institutions, have paid attention to the question of operationalizing access to socioeconomic rights and making socioeconomic rights a central preoccupation of policy making. And therefore, it's not just as a matter of ensuring the dignity and well-being of the most marginalized, as COVID-19 has made it clear, it's also about the collective well-being of society as a whole. That is what COVID-19 has underscored. And I think we no longer can debate whether or not public services are fundamental human rights questions or issues. I think if there is a time that completely settled this debate about whether access to public services is a fundamental human rights issue, it is this moment. And what we are pushing for is whether or not we mobilize all sectors of society to seize this window of opportunity in order to reverse this tendency of marginalizing and peripheralizing the provision of resources and the prioritization in policies of the ever-increasing expansion of access to social services. And indeed, the accompanying trend that we have witnessed in our part of the world, both in terms of commercialization of these services, thereby making access, particularly for the marginalized, ever more far into the future and potentially unattainable, or the lack of provision of funding and hence prioritization, and the resultant condemnation of those most marginalized, the poor, from not being able to live a life of dignity, free from hunger, free from ill health. And really, I think this initiative today needs to be translated into how, in human rights practice, in public policy, these public service issues become central in terms of establishing that the state bears primary responsibility for funding and expanding access to these public services first and foremost, and that the role of other actors is supplementary and complementary to this primary role of the state. And indeed, I think it's important to link this not only with the intersection of the three major issues that you have identified, but also with other human rights issues, such as those that have been identified by Philip Alston in his great work on poverty, for example, and issues relating to widening inequalities, gender oppression, racism. I think these are, from our discussions in the African human rights system, some of the pressing human rights issues of our time, with which access to public service for creating not only a dignified condition for exercising rights, but also resilience for fending off the adverse consequences of not only a pandemic like this one, but also the climate emergency that we are all facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Solomon. We appreciate the very clear message that there should be no debate that access to public services should be a fundamental right after what we've been through. Aoife, if you can move forward.
Hi, Glenda, thanks so much. And thank you. A pleasure to follow Solomon, very thought-provoking. And I think what I'm going to say is unsurprisingly ties in with a lot of what he has said already. I mean, I think there's, obviously I speak to you as someone who works in human rights and who is a member of an expert committee that monitors human rights achievement across Europe. And it is very clear from, with both those hats on, the public services are a key and irreplaceable means by which human rights are achieved. And I think it's important to note that while there's a tendency, to recognize or to stress the importance of public services in the context of economic and social rights achievement, it's equally important to note that public services are invaluable when it comes to securing civil and political rights, such as the right to life and privacy, as well, of course, as the rights of children and other groups that are particularly dependent upon state provision and support. Now, I'm Vice President of the European Committee of Social Rights, and our work in monitoring state efforts to give effect to the European Social Charter has historically included a very strong and frankly deliberate focus on public services. We look at the design, the development, the delivery, the coverage, the outcomes of public services in great detail when we look at the different rights under the Charter, whether we're looking at the rights to social and medical assistance, the right to adequate housing, to protection of health, the rights of disabled persons or older persons. It would not be possible for the vast majority of European Social Charter rights to be achieved without universal quality public services. That is true at any time, and it is particularly true in this time of multiple crises. And Glenda, the question you've asked has flagged those three fundamental crises that we have in our minds now. But one of the positives, I would say, in Europe of the COVID crisis is that it has brought public services and the role of the state front and center. And in a way, the health and public services delivery catastrophe in some areas caused by COVID has meant that the state is no longer a dirty word. Suddenly we realize why we need the state, why we need public services. And particularly, there have been key shortcomings in private actor delivery of public services, particularly in areas like social care, residential care. Okay, and this has meant that public, private, and other models of privatization and models of delivery have been held up to public and media scrutiny in a way that hasn't happened before, and they have been found wanting. The mental health crisis, the housing inadequacies that were laid bare by COVID have highlighted long-term failings in Europe in terms of areas historically covered by public services or understood to be the legitimate focus of public services. In contrast, the public health response and the social protection measures taken in many countries in response to the pandemic have made clear the important role and potential of public services to a much wider group of people, and to people who would not have historically perceived themselves as beneficiaries, as being implicated by the delivery or non-delivery of public services. And I think it's worth saying that it is, just to finish, that it is clear that the dominant economic policy paradigm and the central role accorded to private actors rather than public actors and services in many European countries, and I'm based in the UK, but certainly this is not something that is limited to the UK, this paradigm, this heavy emphasis on and preference for service delivery by private actors has not served to provide an effective response to the pandemic, the crises that have followed the pandemic, and the inequalities crisis that has been brewing for a long time. And it is increasingly clear, and it is very positive that it's being recognized, that this paradigm, this approach to public services and private actors is not even close to beginning to provide a solution to the climate and ecological crises. Okay, so what I would say is without public services, we can't secure human rights. And without human rights, there is absolutely no way that we are going to be able to address the diverse crises that we as a European society and as a global society are facing at the moment.
Thank you, Eva. You talked about the failure in Europe, and then you made it very clear it's a failure that's been globally seen. Pedro, would you address the question?
Yes. Well, first of all, it is a great honor to be here with all of you. So thank you for this invitation. Well, humanity faces a crisis that is, used to say, as tragical as it is paradoxical. The global water crisis on the water planet, the blue planet, with these 2.2 billion people without guaranteed access to safe drinking water. People who are not, the vast majority, properly thirsty people without water in their living environment, but impoverished people living next to polluted rivers and aquifers. Therefore, the root, from my point of view, causes of the global water crisis lie at the confluence of two major structural flaws in our development model. First one, the flaw of unsustainability of our aquatic ecosystems, well, turning water from being the key to life into a terrible vector of disease and death. And second, the flow of poverty, inequality, and discrimination under the prevailing socioeconomic order. Well, to make matters worse, today we are suffering from three factors from my point of view that directly or indirectly aggravate and deepen this global crisis. First of all, the privatization, commodification, and financialization of water. Second, climate change, of course. And third, recently, the COVID-19 pandemic that deepen inequalities and expand poverty. Well, under the neoliberal vision of water as a mere economic good, people become mere customers. And those 2.2 billion people become poor customers, making the poorest even more vulnerable, aggravating this crisis, weakening the fulfillment of human rights and degrading democratic water governance. Regarding SDG 6, Face to the Climate Change, it is claimed that there is a financial gap, due to a lack of public funds, which may induce a financialization of WASH investments. However, after the never explicitly acknowledged failure of the austerity strategy in 2008 and its tragic consequences on poverty and inequality, the strategy today is, in fact, really very different. Significant post-pandemic public funds are available for the so-called Green New Deal of the 21st century. The key challenge after the ordeal of the pandemic is to decide on priorities and whether we allocate a significant part of these funds to strengthen public health system, including water and sanitation as the cornerstone of public health. The pandemic has generated an overwhelming consensus around the world on the need to strengthen our public health systems as a public, not-for-profit effort that must leave no one behind. And we need to integrate water and sanitation services into this consensus and this approach. The key is to understand the very nature of the fundamental challenge we face. And in my view, we face first and foremost a global democratic challenge. Recently, my concern about the commodification of water has been compounded by the news that water has begun to be traded on Wall Street futures markets under the rule of speculative strategies. Futures markets with the deregulation of the late 1990s became dominated by large banks and institutional investors who are neither producers, traders, nor consumers, and who simply speculate. The arguments used at the beginning of the century to speculate on food are similar to those used today for water in the face of climate change. Uncover the prices of an uncertain future and stabilize them. Yet when the housing bubble was about to burst in 2008, the same banks responsible for the crisis that were rescued, in fact, with taxpayers' money, invested billions of dollars in food futures. What happened was the opposite as promised. Food commodity prices doubled and even tripled. In a few months, price volatility soared. And according to the World Bank, some 150 million people joined the ranks of hungry and extreme poverty. Well, in my last report to the UN General Assembly on the risks and impacts of commodification and financialization of water, my recommendations are, in short, first, recognizing water as a public good and not as a commodity. Second, promoting democratic water governance on the sustainable and human rights-based approach. And third, developing participatory strategies for adaptation to climate change in line with the UN and experts' proposals, which have nothing to do with speculative strategies and commodification of water. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro. And we'll have Magdalena follow up your wonderful conversation about how we cannot commodify water, especially on our blue planet, the water planet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda. And apologies for the problems with the camera at the very beginning. I think that now it has been solved. I'm happy to respond to this question, and it's very close, my response, to what other previous speakers have said. I believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has made evident the consequences of decades of privatization, commercialization, and systemic underfunding of services essential for ensuring a dignified life for all, such as education, healthcare, water and sanitation, and housing. Across the world, the weakness of public healthcare and education system, overburdened, underfunded, and understaffed as a result of austerity measures and decades of neoliberal policies, has exacerbated society's vulnerability to COVID-19 and has aggravated inequalities. For example, A large-scale school closure and lack of support for digital and remote learning have deepened structural inequalities in access to education, with a specific implication for girls and young women. Gender inequality has also increased. Data demonstrate that the gender gap in care has widened substantially since the outbreak of COVID. School closure and overstretched health system have seen additional caring responsibilities shifted onto women who, due to structural discrimination and social norms, are those who most often fill the gaps when households and communities no longer have access to social services. The economic, social, and care crisis generated by the pandemic go beyond the lack of capacity of our health and economic system to deal with the rapid onset of health crisis. They also reveal the failure and limitations of an economic model based on commodification and financialization of delivery of economic, social, and cultural rights. Market-based models have failed to deliver ESG rights and ensure a dignified life for all. New, transformative policies are needed to redress inequalities and ensure fully inclusive and resilient societies. Despite the urgency of doing things differently, there are worrying signs that there will be a return to business as usual, and the mistake of the past will be repeated. Responding to the powerful forces that are pushing for austerity and for a privatized, commercialized future require strong narratives that can challenge the neoliberal discourse that has driven policy and decision-making over the last decades. It is time for a new approach, one that takes us away from the neoliberal agenda. This can be done by putting human rights at the center of the economy and increasing investment in public services. We need to advance and promote an alternative vision of the economy and a society that can galvanize civil society action and the public. The human rights framework, we believe, is unequivocal in this respect. Under human rights law, states have an obligation to provide universal quality public services. Human rights monitoring bodies at the global and the regional levels have increasingly recognized that the enjoyment of rights, such as education, water, sanitation, health, and housing, require quality, transparent, participatory, democratically governed, and trusted public services. This challenges the traditional view that human rights standards are neutral regarding public services. It also means that strong, quality, universal public services are not just a charitable option, but also an obligation for states. And for us, I think that at GI, this is the key message also that we want to pass. The human rights system has evolved regarding the way in which it considers public services, and it is time that we recognize this progressive new interpretation of this right. Thank you very much, Glenda.
Thank you, Magdalena. Really important to how you center human rights and make it clear all of these services are not charitable. They have to be part of the public good and the public. So we're running a little late on time. So to make sure that we get all of our questions answered, I'm going to go to the second question, ask our panelists to stay within 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience and our participants then. The next question is, this time last year, as I've already said, a group of 7 current and former UN Special Rapporteurs came together and in the first installment of this discussion to reflect on human rights and the impact of privatization and the importance of public services. What do you see as being the structural barriers to challenging privatization and building public alternatives? How do you see this work as connecting with the work of other movements, such as the tax justice movement and the debt movement, and the work in specific sectors such as education and housing? And we'll have responses from Philip, Kumba, Lilani, and Leah. Philip?
Thanks very much, Glenda. It's a privilege to be on a call with so many people who have contributed so importantly to this debate. There's no question that public services are absolutely vital going forward, that they have been neglected, and that the various crises that we're seeing, particularly COVID, but also climate change, are underscoring the extent to which public services have been let go of and are inadequate to responding to the problems that we're now facing. That's all pretty straightforward. I think where I would inject a note of caution is to reflect on the role that has been played so far by the human rights movement as a whole. I think if we step, this is a very particular group. I'm particularly delighted, as I said, to be in the company of such a group. I've never met Pedro, but I've read his recent report to the General Assembly and on commodification and so on. It's terrific. It continues the excellent work that Leo did. But we have to look at the rest of the human rights community, which has effectively been neoliberalized. The sort of issues that we're talking about, the political economy of rights, are not at the center of the agenda for the great majority of human rights actors. And that's a real problem and something that we can't downplay the significance of. I think we also, and I'm sorry if I'm injecting an unduly pessimistic note, have to look at where we are right now in terms of this range of issues. I think there's a group of human rights actors who are making really important contributions. The group that Magdalena is with, the work that Aoife is doing, and my various fellow former and present rapporteurs are all on the very progressive side of things in the human rights movement. But just very briefly to step back and look at the other side of the balance sheet, we've got the COP coming up in Glasgow. There's not a document that doesn't mention de-risking and the central role to be played in combating climate change of the private sector. If we go to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Secretary General and most governments have given up on mobilizing finance other than from the private sector. It's all about public-private partnerships. If we look at the IMF, and this was just mentioned, I think, by Magdalena, we can envisage the return of austerity policies. And a key part of that, again, is privatization. The World Bank since 2015 has been devoted to nothing other than privatization. And all of these actors are really pushing in exactly the opposite direction to what we're talking about now. And so the question is, how can the human rights community manage to somehow push back? And I think we need to not overlook the central importance of, first of all, making the point that Aoife made, that public services are central to all rights. It's not just economic and social rights. It's not just the communists among us, like me, I'm saying that facetiously, who believe in social rights. It's people who are narrowly focused on civil and political rights who should be scared to death of what's going on, because the elimination of public services is going to eventually undermine all of those rights as well, not even starting to talk about economic and social rights. I just want to mention one example and then I'll finish. In a couple of weeks from now, a group of us at NYU, along with Hakijami in Kenya, will be producing a detailed report on the privatization of healthcare in Kenya. And it's a classic example of how the rhetoric of the Sustainable Development Goals and of universal healthcare and so on is being employed, while the public services in relation to health are being allowed to run down dramatically, leading to popular demand saying this is hopeless, we need private care, and the government then pumping large amounts of public money into private healthcare, which is going to produce, again, the classically totally unequal system of healthcare and lock it in for decades to come. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Philip, thanks for your pragmatism and just a reminding of things that we're facing as we try to deal with the importance of public services. Kumba, can we hear from you next?
Volunteer?
Yes.
Pleasure. Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet all of the team and colleagues. Je voudrais donc parler.
I would like to speak French, if you allow me. I fully agree with what has been said by my colleagues and have really set the stage of a series of challenges on the issue of privatization. Let us not forget the main questions. I think the main one is, what kind of society do we wish to build? What kind of world do we want to live in? Is it one that is more just, one that is fairer, one that is a world of peace, one that is a world of solidarity? I believe these fundamental values should be defended, first of all, the type of society, the type of world that we would like to live in. That is really key and basic for me. This is really the basic, the bedrock, so to speak. What kind of society, what kind of humanity do we want? And then, based on this vision, we can then look at public services. And let me please focus mostly on education, which is, of course, related to the mandate that I'm in charge of at the UN. The first lesson learned from this global crisis is actually a series of lessons. The first one is that states have the main obligation of public service delivery, and that applies specifically to education. And I think that this should be said and repeated. The state should be the main provider of an inclusive public education service. And it must be free, of course. To me, this is really the first fundamental element. Then, second, we noted through the crisis that, like other sectors, education was already facing issues of structural inequalities that actually already existed in education, but also in other social sectors. And there were 1 billion human beings who had not had access to education, who were still illiterate, mostly women, girls, people belonging to poor families, migrants, refugees, or people in different situations of vulnerability. And what we've seen with COVID-19 is that the private schools are the ones that remained sorry, the interpreter corrects. It was the public educational sector that remained open during the crisis, while the private schools were unfortunately not able to pay the teachers anymore. And so what does this mean? Well, the fundamental lesson learned from this crisis is that during crises and beyond, the private sector is not the solution. The private sector, and especially the commodification of education and public service, is not a resilient and sustainable option in the long run. Third, the involvement of different stakeholders. If we really maintain and defend the responsibility and the involvement of stakeholders, then the situation will be very different. Unfortunately, the networks of students have completely been forgotten. The states closed down, and they were basically completely closed to dialogue between different stakeholders. And unfortunately, they were not able to take part in the decision-making process during the crisis. And this is unfortunately something that should be said and repeated, this participation. And of course, the responsibility of different stakeholders is fundamental. And lastly, I would like to support this movement that was kicked off by civil society. And I would like to tell them that they are the main voice. Basic public services must be defended by a cooperation, by a joint construction, because that's the reality. The set of human rights are interdependent. Different rights, such as health, education, and right to a decent life in general, everything is connected, you see. And so in that sense, we need to keep constructing, we need to keep building jointly. And so in that sense, I would like to congratulate the whole team. And I would like to tell you that we are fully available to keep working and building jointly with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Reminding us that this discussion really is about what kind of world we want, what kind of world we want to live in. And let's hear from Leilani, and followed by Leo.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be in this conversation. I love thinking about the kind of world I'd like to live in, and that I think we all should live in, versus the one we're in the moment. Although I really shouldn't complain too much. I am in Paris at the moment, so yes. I agree with what the previous speakers, all of them, have said. I think in the area of housing and the human right to housing, the conversation sort of is a little different somehow. I don't want to dwell in it too much, but the bottom line is, where housing is concerned, is it has been deeply privatized for a very long time. And so I myself have tried to shift the conversation a little bit away from just talking about privatization as problematic, and focus a little more squarely on the problematic of the financialization of housing, which is somewhat different than just its privatization. The chief barrier that I think we're facing in this particular area is that we need a huge and fundamental paradigmatic shift across the board. A shift, I think, obviously, where housing is viewed and understood as a human right. We tend not to talk about it so much as a public service, although it has those elements, but certainly as a human right. And shift away from the idea of housing as a financial instrument, instrument of investment, a way to grow capital, a place to hide capital, and shifting that paradigm and that narrative that is so entrenched is super difficult, and a huge uphill is what I'm seeing. And the reason is because I think it's complete. I think the narrative is complete. I think the neoliberal agenda has cemented this in most societies, developing, developed, emerging, peripheral, whatever you want to call them. And it's in the deep fabric. So it's in our laws, it's in our taxation laws, it's in our preferential tax treatment of certain entities over others. It's the way in which interest rates are set. It's about quantitative easing, which we're seeing now in the COVID era, and the role that central banks are playing in this. It's in golden visa programs. It is so, I mean, I could go on. So it is so deeply, deeply part of legislative and regulatory framework. So that's a huge challenge. And then when I shift, so, okay, well, who are the actors in this financialization of housing? That presents itself also as a big challenge, because it is some of the folks the privates that Philip mentioned, that are being used to move forward the SDGs, for example, supposedly move forward the SDGs. So private equity firms that have so much capital. And, you know, we talk about the corporate capture of the state. Well, it's the private equities that have done this. They are at every political table. They are advising every government around the world to get through COVID. We see also that some of the actors are heads of state, right? Look at the Pandora Papers, whether it was King Abdullah or President Kenyatta. They're all using housing, real estate as a vehicle to hide their cash and to avoid paying taxes. And that contributes to the global housing crisis that we have. They all invest in real estate. And then add to that the actors who you think might be our allies, pension funds. You know, you might think, well, you know, pension funds have understood that they should go green themselves and make sure their investments are green. Well, pension funds are hugely invested in residential real estate, driving up the cost and the unaffordability of housing. And then if I look, just, and I'll end here, at the states that are, in fact, a little interested in housing as the public, who may be concerned with homelessness, what they're not doing is connecting that deep financialization of housing with their efforts to address the housing crisis on their hands. And my firm sense, and based on what I've seen, is that those efforts will fail unless and until financialization is addressed. And sorry, this is my last comment, which is when I look at these big, you know, international global commitments that are being made, this is also cementing the financialization of housing. Philip mentioned this as well. If you look at the SDGs, if you look at Goal 11, Target 11.1, which deals really with cities and housing, you'll see every city around the world and every government around, national level government around, is saying this is all going to happen through private capital and bringing in foreign investors into housing, or it's about developing mortgage-based housing systems, which is a form of financialization. Also, the climate change movement is having really bad effect on housing, driving the cost of housing up in many ways. So lots of barriers here, but an insistence by social movements, NGOs, academics, et cetera, that we need this big paradigmatic shift now is the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Leilani. A lot to think about with the financialization of housing and the conversations that have to be had as we're setting priorities and moving and trying to fix these things with this opportunity. Leo?
Thank you, Glenda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And congratulations for the organization of this very interesting event. Well, the question is about barriers to face privatization and to address how public services are important. And I think we need to talk about the ideological background that frames these structural barriers in this sense. And I would highlight the mainstream narrative around the benefits of privatization that this ideological background poses. And this narrative is very clear from key vehicles of media, political analysts, public organizations even, and orthodox economists, and also, of course, some international agencies that poses the privatization as the remedy to face the lack of access to public services, of collective services. It's interesting to say that also some potential neutral approaches, and I think Philip addresses that, from the human rights community that frames privatization as something similar to the public provision of services, the issue of the agnosticism in terms of doesn't matter who provides the services, what matters is the outcome of the provision. I think this influences strongly and has a similar outcome of the narrative that supports clearly the privatization of services. Often this narrative assumes a position that the public is intrinsically inefficient and the private sector would bring efficiency to collective services. In the water and sanitation services, this is very clear how several people, several key players frames the public services as intrinsically ineffective or inefficient. And particularly because I would say the natural monopoly that characterizes the water and sanitation services is a door to enter this type of narrative, to say that, see, if you have only one provider in this natural monopoly sector, this provider, if it is public, will be captured by corruption, et cetera, inefficiency, high salaries, et cetera. So I would say that this barrier, this ideological background is due to an ideological wash produced over decades and has been clearly strengthened in this neoliberal era. I think we need to make clear this process. Of course, there are some counter-hegemonic movements, particularly in the water and sanitation sector, showing and supporting the public managed and the public provision of services as a way to face the high deficit in terms of including marginalized groups of the society in the access of the services. I have a feeling that there is a need for us to improve the assessments of the benefits from the public services and the human rights risks from the private provision. And this challenge is both theoretical and empirical, in my view. And as an example, as a very particular example, in my report to the General Assembly about the human rights risks from privatization of water and sanitation services, I proposed a theoretical framework based in 3 dimensions. One is the profit maximization by the private providers. The second dimension is the asymmetry of power, the power asymmetry. And the third is the characteristic of natural monopoly of the sector. So the combination of these 3 factors poses a higher risk for violation of the human rights by the private provision. I think we need to exercise more this type of construction, theoretical construction, also collecting empirical data in terms of demonstrating our points, our arguments. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. I think what you talked about in just terms of the assessment of public services, someone else talked about how we have to make sure that we're showing that things are working when it's public service. And obviously your point about human rights, the human rights risks from privatization are a big deal, especially since there's so much money right now going around and how there's just a real danger. We have a number of questions from, thank the panelists for all the answers you've given. There's so much at stake and so many rights, bedrock rights that are impacted. But let me get some questions that we have from our participants. We have a couple. We're gonna ask two people to reply to answers, give about 2 or 3 answers, and have at least 4 questions. I might have more as we go. So let me just go to the first question. Just give me a second. The first question is from George Hashaka. How can we have effective and efficient public services for all when governments undermine professional bureaucracy by politicization of public service delivery mechanisms? Again, how can we have effective and efficient public service for all when governments undermine professional bureaucracy by politicization, I'm sorry, long day, of public service delivery mechanisms? Who'd like to address that question? I'm not shy calling on folks.
Well, if you want, I can.
Thank you.
I can do it. Yes. Well, I think that when we talk about public management, we are talking about not just public management, but participative and transparent public management. So if we have no democracy because the government is not democratic, public management is not enough. This is the key issue. So I think is necessary, at least convenient, to have public management, but is not enough. We need to ensure citizens' participation, public participation, and transparency.
I'm actually going to go to the manifesto because it talks about it. It talks about public services are owned by the people and for the people. They're collectively and democratically determined and developed. So again, that goes to your point. It's just not enough that they're publicly managed, but there has to be transparent. There has to be democracy. It has to be the ends and the means have to all lie with the people. Magdalena, were you going to answer or this question also?
I can follow actually on what you said and to say that what is important actually is and I'm going to go back to what Aoife said. I mean, I think that we might not have, and in many countries around the world, we might not have the public services that we want, and that is a reality. And there is an opportunity now. I think that we are in a crossroad, and the point is that in this crossroad, in which, due to the pandemic, or the silver lining of the pandemic, is that we have a great majority of people, an impressive amount of citizens around the world and middle classes that have realized how important are public services and have access to quality public healthcare and public and education. This is a moment in which we can push forward against those forces that are pushing back, and they are as strong as usual. I agree on that. We have the IMF pushing for austerity measures. We have the UN pushing and the Secretary General pushing for PPPs, and even the SDGs. I mean, most of the implementation measures that are proposed for the SDGs are based on privatization or increasing the role of private actors and even commercialization and financialization. So the point here is, at this crossroad in which states are pushed towards increasing the role of private actors because they are confronting an economic crisis caused by the pandemic. Many countries have a high level of debt. So they're in this situation in which it's very tempting to actually go back to the policies that they have implemented in the past. But the point is, we know that those policies have failed. Austerity and fiscal consolidation has translated in a massive violation of human rights. And this is when we believe that using the narrative of human rights and going back and rescue this progressive interpretation of rights and saying we have to look at human rights as demanding public services and not any type of public services. It might be the public services that we don't have now, but public services that have certain characteristics are by the public and for the public. This public services, this is the moment, and we might have a very small window of opportunity. And I think that the human rights movement has to strongly push for and take advantage of this moment and push forward in order to remain relevant at this moment of time. Thank you very much, Glenda.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to add to this? Okay, great. Thank you. I think it's Kumba.
Thank you so much, Madame the Moderator. Je voudrais juste compléter parce que
I would like to complete what has just been said because I fully agree by what has been said. And I would like to repeat what was said about the participation of different actors. This is something I stressed at the beginning. I would like to tell you about two experiences. Civil society has done some research lately in those countries where we have proof of the efficiency of public services in those countries, even if those are third world countries or not very wealthy regions. But we've seen that a number of actors were ready to take part, to be responsible, to stress values such as transparency in management. And I think that Mr. Aubry and his team have researched on this subject, and I think that these best practices should be published because they do exist in the world. Then the second aspect is the political will. I would like to stress that political will is important. It's not a panacea. It's not the role of society, of social actors. I think that those who defend human rights, civil society and researchers themselves, I think that this co-construction is fundamental and should continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A discussion just about that we use the proof that's before us of efficiency of how this has worked. And there's just a lot to do. Obviously, the conversation and the work of the folks who are on the panel and the work of the folks who are the participants will move us forward. But obviously, this is a key time to try to take advantage of the lessons that we've learned, the very clear lessons that we've all learned and seen from the different crises that we're dealing with, COVID-19, as well as the inequalities that we've seen, and as well as a looming environmental crisis. Second, another question from Joanna Wagman how to answer critics saying that the push for public services financed, organized, and delivered by states is ideological, whereas having the private sector involved would be the efficient way to go. This, despite what most of the panelists' works demonstrates to the contrary. It seems that the economic actors, especially international finance institutions, do not respond to evidence-based arguments, and that the human rights compass is not what guides policy anymore. Hence, how do we change the work that we do to make folks listen to us? Leo, would you take that one? Pedro's hand is raised. And then Leo, and then Pedro.
I can just start. Yeah, it's interesting, this argument that the public, those who support the public services are ideological. But the question is that those that support the privatization are not ideological. Why ideology is in one side and not in the other side? So I think the argument is that it's a logical argument. Everything is ideological. Everything is based on our vision of the world. So if we support the public service, we are ideological, but also if those that support the privatization and the replacement of the state by the private actors, they are also ideological. So I think that we need to play this game of the logic of the arguments.
Thank you, Leo. Pedro?
Hablaré en español.
I will speak in English. Well, ideology is not bad, regardless of the side or the stance. But other than ideology, we need consistency and rationality when we are faced with a challenge. For example, when we talk about water, we are talking about 2 billion people that have no drinking water, 4.2 billion people without sanitation. The characteristic across these billions of people, they are all people under extreme poverty. So is it, should we think of this as a window of opportunity for investment, or is it an international challenge? What is the consistency in this? I believe that there is evidence. The privatizing approach can be useful in order to run a profitable business, but not to solve this human rights issue, especially that affects mainly the poorest in the world.
Thank you, Pedro. I just want to remind folks who are raising their hand, who are participants, unless you're on the panel, you really need to put your questions in the Q&A and in the Q&A. We may not be able to answer it now, but we will save it, so we will, be able to address it at later times. Leilani, you wanted to comment?
Very briefly, and only to say, I've heard, of course, those arguments as well, but they're always in my sector, they're always by the people who benefit from those arguments. In other words, the privates engaged in exacerbating the housing crisis. So in that way, it's sort of, if you just point that out, it's truth-telling in a way. And the only other thing I'll say is, I guess recently I've had some pretty good experiences working with city-level governments. And I find, because they're on this front line of everything at the moment, whether it's climate, the pandemic, the global housing crisis, whatever, gross inequality, I find a lot of cities really struggling, and they're casting about and they're looking for something else. They may not be so bold as to say neoliberalism needs to be dead, if it's not dead, but they are bold enough to say they're looking for something, some answers. And necessity, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention or whatever. We don't really, what I try to offer is not invention, but just human rights, which are really practical and which governments are have committed to, and that city governments have obligation with respect to. So, but I do find it interesting that city governments are starting to cast about. And I think for whoever asked that question, cities are the biggest violators of human rights, but they can also be real promoters and on the front lines of fulfillment.
Thank you, Leilani. Let's go to another question from Jose Mendoza. Faced with the imposition of profit over the interests and needs of the great majority and the necessary protection of socioeconomic rights, how to promote policies that punish, prevent socioeconomic crimes and abuse? Anyone? It is interesting to ask that question, I think, for folks who kind of study the impact, and perhaps we just need to have dialogues with other folks who could give us the advice about the policies to punish and prevent the socioeconomic crimes that can come about if we don't get the answers. Any questions, any potential answers from our panelists? Okay, Pedro.
Bueno, obviamente.
Well,
Se necesita lo que hemos dicho, un marco.
we obviously need a democratic framework, and that means suitable and enforceable laws. But for me, the key element, in addition to the legal framework, is citizen participation. If there is no participation, if there is no transparency, then it will be really difficult to fight corruption. The key lies with transparency in management and in public participation, open participation.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's something that we've talked about and different panelists have talked about in a number of different ways. Let me go to another question. Just give me a second. This is from Ruth Salbrick. Many thanks for this session and for all the speakers and organizations. Can all panelists reflect on the subsidy currently provided to the economy disproportionately by women in unpaid care and domestic work, and how this reflects in the value of public services? It would be great maybe if Aoife could start, and if Aoife could start with that question. I'll read it again. Can all panelists reflect on the subsidy currently provided to the economy disproportionately by women in unpaid care and domestic work, and how this reflects in the value of public services?
I think there's a number of ways in which you can engage with that question. And I'm going to be a little bit careful on this because we as a committee are doing work at the moment around informal carers. But I think it's very clear that the way in which we conceptualize public services, who carries them out, those who benefit from them, is often quite exclusive of the lived experience of many women, particularly those who are involved, say, in caring and other informal activities that are not taken into account. And I think if we're talking about, I think it's very interesting that, for instance, one of the things that I noticed in the manifesto is there's this talk about public services and labor right, labor conditions and work conditions and labor rights for public service workers. And one of the things I think we need to be careful about when we do public service work is that we acknowledge and bear in mind that if we focus on certain sectors and certain groups, there is a risk that we will forget the position of other groups who will thus be disadvantaged. I mean, it'll be good news for those who are deemed part of public sector, what you say, part of public sector workers, but then have a disproportionate disadvantage on those who are left outside. So I think really what I would say is that I think the question raises an important point that we all need to bear in mind as we engage with public services, their definition, their design, the people who benefit from them, and their outcome.
Thank you, Aoife. Does anyone else want to address that question? Magdalena?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that this is a critical question. And I think that what we need to keep in mind is just every time that there is a cut on public services, those who are disproportionately impacted are women. Because if there is a cut on childcare, a cut on the care for the elderly, these are good examples in which, or a cut in public health care services, the shift, the care is done at home, and due to social norms is done by women. And these cuts and austerity measures are possible because we're shifting the burden into women's shoulders, and this is critical. So the more public services, more investment in good quality public services will diminish the unpaid care and domestic work for women. And also, on the other side, we also find that women are overrepresented in the public sector workforce. Therefore, again, any cut in the public service workforce, it is disproportionately impacted on women. And on the other hand, a third view is that public services also need to provide the services being taking into account gender, because public services are not neutral and they need to be provided, taken into account the different needs of men and women, girls and boys.
Thank you. Kumba has her hand up also.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Excellent. Je voudrais vraiment dire
Thank you. I would like to really echo the two women who spoke before me, and sadly, it was only women who spoke about that. I would have loved to hear the point of view of a man as well on that question, because, of course, this unpaid work done by women on a daily basis is huge. And this is covering, of course, childcare, care for the elderly. And I believe that this question was very well responded by my two predecessors. But I would like to insist once again on the role of education. It is fundamentally important that education really grasps this social perspective based on gender. We need to integrate this gender-based approach in our vision, in our view of the world, understand the role of each member of the family in the development of our society through the provision of those services for our global humanity. And I think this is key. This is what this is all about. We need to start from early childhood through education and make sure that this education can also cover other members of the community, both in formal education, but also in informal education. Make sure that the whole community is educated. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Leilani, your hand was up for this also?
Yeah, just very briefly, and I don't want to take us too far afield, but just to say, I've always felt that the second-class status of economic, social, and cultural rights is deeply tied to the fact that they are so deeply relevant to women's lives, and that because of the association with social and economic rights, with motherhood issues, and I know this so well as having been the rapporteur on the right to housing and how I was treated as a woman pushing the right to housing. And I was strong in my deliberations and discussions with government. They were expecting motherhood issue, softy, and they didn't, that's not what they received. And it always underscored for me on every country visit I went to, that there is a perception that social and economic rights are somehow women's rights and therefore lesser importance. Just an observation.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure I manage enough time because we still have a couple questions, but we have other things to do. So I'm going to, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, I'm going to go to a video now where we're fortunate enough to have a video from, hold on just a second. We'll just start the video and then we'll reflect on that and go to a third question.
Public services are essential for the realization of human rights and are crucial to address high and rising inequalities in the region. For instance, access to medicines and health technologies without discrimination in quality and affordability is an essential part of the content of the right to health. As we have highlighted in the report Business and Human Rights Inter-American Standards, the activities and behaviors of the pharmaceutical industry has a decisive impact on the realization of such a right. In the context of COVID-19 pandemic, the access to medicines and health services, it has been a big challenge, especially for the most vulnerable populations. In this regard, the clearest example of inequality is today the lack of universal and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines in our region, where the majority of the countries do not exceed 40% of coverage with a complete vaccination schedule. Privatization and commercialization without adequate state action have had disastrous impact of human rights in the region, limiting access to services essential for human dignity to those able to pay, and thereby exacerbating inequalities to the detriment of the most marginalized. States have a human rights obligation to provide public services for all people without discrimination. This has been recognized by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in several of the reports it has published. Also, the additional protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Protocol of San Salvador, explicitly acknowledges that everyone should have the right to live in a healthy environment and to have access to basic public services. I am speaking today from a continent that is still very much in the midst of the pandemic. The week before, world leaders met to discuss the growing urgency of another major crisis, the impacts of which are already being acutely felt through the continent. It is crucial that we find a new approach to organizing society and the economy, one that is centered around human dignity. In this context, I echo the sentiments expressed by civil society in the Manifesto that was launched yesterday. Strong public services are critical to responding to the crises that are jeopardizing our future and to building more equal and inclusive societies that guarantee the right of all. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
So we want to thank Soledad Garcia, Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in the Americas, for her participating by video. Now, before we get to a discussion about the manifesto, I do want to ask a question of Philip and Solomon, just because you added so much to the original couple of questions. We'd like to hear from you again. This is from Miss Debrila Yosufu from Cameroon. Public services are mostly managed by the central state. hold on just a second, by the central state. In the context of decentralization, like in Cameroon, how can you ensure that municipalities play their role? It would be great if Solomon or Philip could answer that question or address it. And if not, I'll take volunteers.
I think this question relates to how the delivery of public service is organized and delivered. And it also touches on the question of accessibility, the proximity. I think in one way, decentralization is a very critical aspect of the delivery of public services, so that people in whatever part of a country they are sitting and living should be able to have access, so that we do not create inequalities in terms of access to public services as well. And decentralization is therefore very key. Here, there are a couple of issues that we need to bear in mind. The first one is obviously the need for taking into account spatial inequalities in terms of the prioritization of distribution of resources, which is key in organizing and delivering access to public services. Thereby, it is a requirement of human rights standards that access is prioritized according to need. Thereby, those with the least access are prioritized in terms of the establishment and delivery of those accesses, whether this is healthcare, bringing healthcare to areas and remote areas where there is none. I think that should be one of the considerations in our analysis of how public services are to be organized and delivered. The other one is, of course, the question of standardization, so that the standard of public service that is delivered in one area wouldn't be qualitatively less than a similar service that is being delivered in other parts of the country, for example. I think this is about the kind of minimum standard that human rights set and require for purposes of what you may consider to be public services that guarantee minimum dignity, minimum life of dignity for individuals and communities. And therefore, there is very significant role for municipalities to play, for districts, for communes to play in this respect. And it cannot be that we leave everything to the central government, whose penetration, more often than not, particularly in our part of the world, is limited to certain parts of the territory in the center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pedro and then Philip, if you have something to add also.
Bueno, en el tema del agua.
Regarding water, in the majority of countries, the responsibility of water management and sanitation belongs to the municipality. And this makes sense because water is very territorial. If a community or a population lives in a certain place, it's because in principle, there was water to have a dignified life. Now, in terms of proximity to the service, and for reasons of territory administration, and also for reasons of effective democratic participation, I think it is important that sanitation and water services are managed locally. This doesn't mean that the state is relieved from its responsibility. It's just that their responsibility is more about surveying or complementing or supporting the capabilities of the municipality. Now, in regions like Latin America, it's important to recognize community management, the network of water aqueducts in Latin America, which is over 80,000, is crucial, and it should not compete against the state. On the contrary, the state should support them at a community level.
Thank you. Philip?
Yes, I think Solomon and Pedro have really covered the ground very well. I'd more or less sum up and say that decentralization is extremely important, just because participation in shaping public services and so on is crucial. But the issue of funding is always an element. And if one simply decentralizes without ensuring that there is adequate funding, it's going to be a problem. And while democracy should be key, there are also minimum standards to be preserved. And so that would normally suggest that there is a continuing role for a central government to make sure that the way it is done in a particular decentralized area is consistent with the human rights obligations.
Thank you. Let's now, we are in the last 15 minutes of our of this panel. It's been very rich, and I know we could probably be here another hour, but we cannot. So so I'd like to ask the last question, and then we can have and I'm asking all panelists to reply, to give about a minute and a half reply. This really relates to the collective manifesto that we heard about at the very beginning of our program that was released yesterday. And just want to have a quick, what's your reaction to the manifesto? How does the growing movement for public services relate to your work and other movements you are connected with? And if I could get a response from all the panelists, if Leilani could go first, because I know she has another obligation, that would be great. But what's your reaction to the manifesto in a minute and a half?
Sure, no problem. So I think the manifesto is cool. I think I like the way it's structured, et cetera. And I just would say this, I'm glad that other people have written the manifesto, because it means I don't have to. And I say that for a bunch of reasons. One is it's hard work, but two is in the work I'm doing right now on the financialization of housing, a manifesto won't open doors for me, because I'm trying to sit with governments, some certain governments, and some of those big actors I was talking about, the private equity firms, investors, pension funds, et cetera. And a manifesto to them will be like me screaming as I enter the room, and that's not how they will greet me. But we need manifestos. And I'm just going to give a quick example, because I think what's happened in Berlin is kind of manifesto style. For those who don't know, there was a really important referendum on September 26th during the general election in Germany. And it was a referendum just in the city-state of Berlin that was motivated by the corporate takeover of housing and rental accommodation in that city. A social movement of tenants and people who care deeply about affordable housing in that city came together and pushed for direct democracy through a referendum. They were successful. They needed to get 150,000 signatures. They got 350,000 and managed to get a referendum on the expropriation of private market rental units from outsized, oversized landlords that own more than 3,000 units. And the expropriation was to socialize some of those units. And they won handily with 60% of the vote. And so just to say that kind of activity, which is kind of manifesto-like, is really useful for in so many different ways. And it's the only way change happens is really from the ground up. I will just say one more thing about the Berliner movement, which is they have rooted it in human rights and they've rooted it in constitutional law. And I think those are two things that make their activities successful. Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me into this conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to go in order. One, manifesto, reaction, no particular order. Magdalena, and we're closing in on our ending time. So,
thank you. I'm going to be brief. I strongly support the manifesto in my personal capacity, but also in the capacity of the executive director of the Global Initiative, that is one of the leading organizations behind the manifesto. I do believe that the manifesto presents a unifying vision of public services that different actors and movements can rally on. And what is also very important is that the manifesto is reflective of a broader dynamic. As evident from today's gathering, there is a growing consciousness regarding the crucial role of public services, and there is an emerging movement bringing together a social movement, civil society actors, academia, from a range of sectors and movements supporting public services. And I think that human rights represent this shared set of values and goals among many different movements fighting for social justice. And at the Global Initiative, we believe that human rights can play a critical role in shifting the narrative and in catalyzing this movement for support public services with the characteristics that are indicated in the manifesto. So we as an organization try to push the frontiers for human rights, and this is our role. We're trying to push the frontiers here in order to make human rights relevant for today's struggles and to face the crisis that we're confronting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pedro's hands up.
Sí, me parece un excelente manifiesto.
I really think this manifesto is excellent. It has a good level of complexity, and I think it's excellent in terms of its approach, promoting a global mobilization. I think we need to develop a powerful global movement of human rights defenders, just like this youth movement against climate change. Human rights should go beyond solidarity with those living in poverty. No, instead of that, they should be at the center of global democratic governance that we all need. And I really think this manifesto goes in this sense. It's not so much about confronting the public and the private. Instead, this manifesto strengthens and develops participative democracy using some global democratic governance references. I like the logic, I support it fully, and I want to congratulate and thank those of you who wrote it.
Thank you. Aoife?
Thanks very much, Glenda. I mean, I think that the manifesto, my response here is in my personal capacity, not the committee, obviously. And I think it serves as a very sensible framework for the conceptualization and the delivery of public services. And I think it's very positive, and I think it's very strategic that it ties in, and I know not accidentally, but it ties in with the main fights and the language of a wide range of movements that have overlapping aims to those of the public services movement. And I think obviously some of the principles that underpin the manifesto, you know, accessibility, equality, universality, non-discrimination, these are all well-known, long-standing, explicit elements of human rights law. But for me, what I thought was really innovative with the manifesto and really useful, in addition to those well-established elements, is its explicit emphasis on public services having to be responsive and transformative. Because I think if you were to criticize public service delivery, and if you were to, leaving aside, you know, inefficiency is one thing, is a language that's often used, but actually responsiveness is absolutely crucial. And when we talk about the notion of services having to adjust to technical changes, different needs and unfolding needs, that is what we are looking for. And in fact, the failure of public services in some instances to do that in the past is part of what has given them a bad name in current times. And I think that one thing I just want to flag, I thought the stress on the need for public services to be environmentally and ecologically conscious is welcome. Right, given this obvious, very clear link between the environment and climate change and human rights. I think there's going to be a challenge, a genuine challenge in striking a balance between potentially conflicting present and future generations' best interests and public service decision making. And I think it's very important that the public services movement recognizes that head on and thinks very carefully about how those tensions, how those potential conflicts are going to be resolved. But overall, I think what the manifesto does is it really neatly intersects with, and it's involved in effective mutual reinforcement with other efforts to advance rights enjoyment that are being pushed domestically and internationally. And I think it's very, very welcome.
Thank you. Leo.
Yes, just to emphasize something that has been said, the manifesto is very timely and I would say necessary, so it's very welcomed. In this time, it's very relevant to highlight the importance of the public sector in the era of neoliberalism, where several people advocate for the replacement of the state by the market. Of course, the document doesn't support any type of public services, and for me, this is very important. Also, Pedro has highlighted the issue of democratic control of the public services, and I think this is very essential in the document, and also public services committed with the most marginalized groups of the society. In other words, I can infer from the manifesto that we need to deprivatize the state. In several situations, the state is colonized by the private interests. So what the manifesto points is the need to have a real public service. If I translate what the manifesto says to the area of water and sanitation, there is a feeling that we need to achieve the SDGs in water and sanitation. The world need to quadruple to be 4 times more fast in terms of the rate of progress to include people in water and sanitation services in the next 10 years. So 2 billion people and 3.6 billion people, half of the world, would need to be included in adequate water and sanitation services, respectively. So I don't see a way to do that without a very strong public services. With the private provision, it will not achieve anything in this sense. Thank you, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Leo. Kumba?
Thank you so much. Je voudrais aussi soutenir vraiment.
I would like to support this manifest. And in the present conjuncture, I'd say that the principles that are mentioned are very important, both concepts and methodologies. I think that the interdependence and interrelationship between the various principles are particularly key. And the main idea is that we talk about public services, the public services that we want, that we deserve. And this is a very strong concept. from the methodology point of view, if I may say so, it would be good to make sure that this movement is rooted, is grassroots. The movement is here, but it should be more deeply rooted in local communities and come from the grassroots. I think that this is key. And it is an advice I would like to give you from a methodology point of view. And I think this is something that you should try and achieve. And it should be forward-looking as well. We should continue this reflection with a forward-looking dimension, because I'm sure that we will be able to make headway if we go along the same lines. For us, in the field of education, I think that we should mention this type of movement as well. So thank you very much and congratulations to the whole team with solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Solomon.
Thank you very much, Glenda. I think this is really a very great initiative, which captures the current consciousness, the current consensus, and indeed expectation of a wide segment of societies in terms of the kind of world, the kind of societies that we would like to live in. With COVID-19, it has become trendy to speak about we're all together in this. I think if at all there is going to be something that is going to capture and embody this sentiment of we're all in this together, it is the provision and access to public services as fundamental public goods and as a matter of human and people's rights. I think this is so critical. So the question really is the kind of the kind of resources, the kind of avenues that the manifestation opens in terms of engaging a number of questions that have been raised in the course of our deliberation today, including on the question of public space, the policy space, as far as the role that the state need to play in respect to social services, in respect to economic policy, and that policy space is the question that relates to the democratic control of public services, which is highlighted in the manifesto. But that depends a great deal on whether or not the regulations, the global financial and economic regulations, and the impact that they have on policy space would allow that effective democratic control and provision of public services is extremely critical. Also important is what this manifesto tells us about the adequacy, or actually the lack of delivery and effectiveness of the dominant economic growth model, which prioritizes GDP growth without regard to what GDP growth means for standard of living of people, and which is dependent on, again, the provision of public services. And without changing the economic development paradigm, whether or not we can be able really to achieve some of the aspirations, some of the fundamental provision of rights, is another issue that I think the manifesto also raises. Also equally important is the questions that it raises with respect to the role of different actors. I think this is extremely important. Particularly so important is the role of the human rights community. I think one of the lessons from COVID-19 is that the human rights community, indeed, the human rights system, have experienced and have failed as far as socioeconomic rights are concerned. And it is that failure that led to the kinds of threats affecting vast majority of people who have been without any access to the basic minimum of amenities that could make them, weather this kind of situation. Ultimately, it has become clear that public services is not a question about whether or not you afford to buy services from the market. It is about the kind of minimum dignified life that each and every one of us are entitled to, and indeed the kind of society that we would like to live in, and the interdependence of access or lack of access of one, and how that actually weakens even those who think that they have the most access and they don't care about others. With COVID-19, we have come to see that if there are people who are exposed to COVID-19, then all of us are exposed to COVID-19, irrespective of our status, and it affects us all. That is why access to public service is a matter of necessity, not just for the not-haves, but also for all of us, the entire members of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If we could just hear Philip, would you like to be our last panelist to comment on this question and your thoughts on the manifesto?
Thanks, Glenda. Last and least, I think the earlier comments have been extremely enlightening. I think the manifesto is a wonderful initiative. What I worry about, of course, is the gap between the aspiration and the reality. And it's useful to focus very quickly on Solomon's example of COVID-19. On the one hand, human rights people say, yep, it's really shown the gap in services, it's shown the indispensable role for the public sector and so on. But the reality is totally different. The reality is that the patent has been retained by a handful of drug companies. 90% of the cost of developing the drug was paid for by governments. Governments and others are not making sure that there is equitable distribution outside the rich countries. There is a COVID apartheid that is going on. And so for me, that points to the big question with the manifesto, which is, what's the strategy for going from these grand aspirations to actually persuading people? How are we going to deal with the counter narrative, which the private sector has so successfully promoted? How do we get people back to the very notion of social rights, that you have a goddamn right to health, and that the government is the one that has to secure this? How do we get back to notions of tax justice, that governments must tax people and must then spend that money to ensure community well-being? And I think that we shouldn't just look then at a manifesto on public services, but look carefully at how it relates to a range of other issues, and particularly the sort of strategies required for promoting the principles in it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for all of your comments. I really appreciate being sitting at your feet and listening to your wisdom in this area. A quick story. When I was in law school, I started at Columbia Law School, and my first year, I was really distressed because I thought the law was all about, what I was taught too much was all about just sustaining society. And what saved my law career was doing work in human rights. I got to go to Kenya for my first summer and do a human rights internship and worked with a lawyer there. And I worked on the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. And that's what saved my life as a lawyer and actually changed my view of the law. So I just appreciate the work that you continue to do. As someone who works in the fields and works for CUNY, the largest public institution in the US, an urban public institution in the United States, we try to practice very practically the work that you're doing and you talk about. We've done some debt forgiveness using the money that we got from the feds, and we've changed policies about holding back transcripts that if students owe money, because that changes life. But we look at this manifesto as a way that we can do more work. So I thank you for the work, those who wrote the manifesto. I thank all the panelists. I thank everyone who put this together, the interpreters who allowed us to listen to different languages. And I just want to end with where we started. I want to end with the first paragraph of the manifesto. And it says, universal quality public services are the foundation of a fair and just society. They constitute a social pact that implements the core values of solidarity, equality, and human dignity. Public services are also an effective way to pool resources to confront collective challenges and meet shared needs. And if we haven't learned anything in this last year and a half or 2 years, is that we have shared needs and we have to do work together. So I look forward to more work being done with this manifesto. And I just so appreciate the panelists and everyone who participated. Have a good day, everybody, and keep working hard as you take care of yourselves.